Hello, my name is Hani Esther Indictor Portner, and you are listening to Passing the Paintbrush, a queer Jewish podcast and workshop series focusing on queer Jewish artists who worked, lived, and loved in Berlin Mitte. In this episode, we will take some time to learn about Gertrude Sandmann, a Jewish lesbian Berliner who survived the Shoah by living underground with the help of her friends, lovers, and lesbian community. She made art with mostly charcoal and chalk pastels, but also painted with watercolors and experimented with printmaking. She created over 9,000 works in her life, many of them female nudes, still lifes, street scenes, and portraits. On this research journey, I visited many locations in Berlin where Sandmann had significant roots and connections. I went to her memorial stone in the cemetery. I went to the house where she grew up on Karlsbad 11 in Tiergarten. I walked around Treptow where she was hidden for 18 months, and by Eisenacherstrasse 103 where she hid until the end of the war. I visited her studio and home at Eisenacherstrasse 89 and looked up to the 4th floor where she would draw and live until she died in 1981. I went to the Berlinische Galerie to visit her emigrant painting series and visited with the many guests you will hear in this episode. I did my best to listen with my whole self and bring you with me as I discovered and learned more about who Gertrude Sandmann was and what she means to us today. A content note. In this episode, listeners should be aware that the following topics will be talked about that may be triggering or difficult to listen to. We will discuss the racist and complex history of European colonialism and imperialism in Asia and Africa and how it manifested in the raw goods trade, with art and antique collecting, and in the exploitation of local people. We will talk about the Shoah, illness, death, murder, starvation, suicide, and name specific concentration camps and the fates of those who did not survive. We will be speaking about racism, antisemitism, homophobia, lesbian erasure. Please take care while listening. Influenced by Dr. Eva Atlan's outlook when curating Back into the Light, 4 women artists, their works, their paths, I will not be starting these stories in 1933.
My name is Eva Atlan and I'm a deputy director of the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. When I made the exhibition, the public didn't begin with Shoah, but they begin with these 4 artists presented in 4 different studios where you can connect to their art and to connect to what is important to them and not the first step to connect as victims of the Shoah, as artists. So we begin at the beginning and then go to what steps and biography. So you get some touches of a personality, because for me it's always interesting not only to know about the style of a painting or of a sketch or drawing, but also to know about the person who is behind it, and to reconstruct like a puzzle a personality.
So, let's start at the beginning. Gertrude Sandmann was born on October 16, 1893, to Ella and David Sandmann, and grew up in an upscale area of Tiergarten with her sister Elsa Vera. Her father was a citizen deputy, commercial judge, alcohol manufacturer, and plantation owner in East Africa, who was a collector of Asian and African antiques and art. When I traveled to the site of Sandmann's family home, now a modern vacant office building that used to house Berlin's tourism department, I was surprised to learn that right next door was Karlsbad 10, once known as the Africa House of the German Colonial Society, or the DKG. Now, it is a residential building with a sign out front created by the organization Africa House, which is doing current-day work to honor and remember these places of German colonial history in Berlin. I asked Justice, who runs a tour company in Berlin educating people about Germany's colonial history, what she thinks of this building.
Hi, my name is Justice. I am the founder of Desta, Decolonial Tours. I founded it in 2022, and my pronouns are she, her. Yeah, so I think this building is super interesting because it just also, I hope, it makes people realize that, colonialism was not something that was only wanted or pushed for by elitarian people, but it was really also something that came from, that were people from civil society, like lower class people or middle class people really wanted and did a lot of like lobbying for it, right? So of course you have the merchants and the businessmen who were pressuring the government, but you also have like everyday people who said, hey, I want to be able to buy my coffee at a low price. So that's why we need to have colonies of our own. And so, this place, you can just I imagine it as basically like a little hub, right? Where people with different interests, with different stories come together, and they are all like against kind of trying to organize and build strategies on how to establish these colonies on the African continent, but also Asia. And so, it's a very, very interesting building.
Because the Sandmann family made their wealth from this plantation, we also talked about the German supermarket chain Edeka, or the purchasing cooperative of colonial grocers.
But the way I imagine it is that different plantation owners, different business people came together and were like, okay, like the transportation costs are super high. For them, you have because even nowadays you have Edeka Schaub, right? Edeka Reichel, so they're all called Edeka, but also their family names is there, right? So you have different business owners coming together and be like, okay, how can we make this project, possible and also profitable, of us having plantations overseas and bringing in the products or the goods to sell it then at a low price to our consumers. And so Edeka, I think it was founded in 1907, where then as an association where they could then basically split the bills, right? And therefore then have a higher margin. Like different, because right now it's like also them, if you have the association or the Einkaufsgenossenschaft, right? Them basically profiting from like being able to build synergies and profiting from maybe also experiences, but also of infrastructures that other people have already built for their Edeka, right? And so it's of course nowadays like a franchise, but in the end of the day, it's really about maximizing profits. So different ways how this era is so romanticized and so downplayed, which has consequences because now we don't then categorize colonialism as a crime, right? As a crime that it actually was. And so for me, it's multiple things that basically drive me or that motivate me to do this work. On one hand, it's like to basically break those myths, right, and really to replace them with facts, and then on the other hand, it's also about like maybe deconstructing this romanticized and glorified narrative around colonialism, because it also doesn't do justice to all the people who died because of that, right? So it's like, I think that's also something that is my motivation, is just to speak the stories, or to like acknowledge the stories of all the people who have suffered from that in the past. And I mean, people like myself suffering from it now. So and also, like, if we don't deconstruct it, and if we don't really don't deconstruct it, our future generations will also suffer from it. So it's not going to go away unless we do something about it. And so we can't do anything about it if we don't know, right? And so let's just start normalizing colonialism, talking about colonialism in a non-glorified way.
It's important to acknowledge that Gertrude Sandmann's access to an arts education and the family's library of over 20,000 volumes was made possible in part through her father's involvement in the atrocity that was German colonialism. In 1913, Sandmann graduated high school, and she then started her first 2 years of studies with Martin Brandenburg, who was a member of Die Vereinigung der Elf, or the Association of the 11. I spoke with Professor Carrie Wallach about her recent book and the historical context of the times for Jewish women in Germany seeking education in the arts.
My name is Carrie Wallach. I use pronouns she, her. I work at Gettysburg College. I am a professor of German studies there and an affiliate faculty member with the Jewish Studies program as well. And I recently completed a book on the artist Rachel Shalit. It's called Traces of a Jewish Artist, The Lost Life and Work of Rachel Shalit. And it recovers a forgotten and murdered artist, and hopefully brings her legacy into the present day for those who are interested in knowing more. The story of how I discovered Rachel Shalit goes back to all the way back to my dissertation research when I was living in Berlin in 2008, and I was looking through old Jewish newspapers from the 1920s and 30s, and I was just reading to find out sort of how women were represented and women's depictions, how women contributed, what they were doing in terms of creative work at that time, and I kept noticing her name over and over again, and her name really stuck out at me, I think partly because it was an East European looking name, and I was really surprised when I wanted to learn more about her that there was almost no information available about her at that time. Later, one article was published about her, but really no one had done extensive research into her. So for me, it really came from working with those primary sources and seeing that Shalit was a figure who was well known in Jewish circles in the 20s and 30s, but then was completely forgotten after the war. So one thing I wanted to put out there in the beginning of my remarks is just that Jewish women were not a monolithic group. So I can't speak about all Jewish women, but some had more or less the same access to structures for learning about art that their non-Jewish women counterparts did, right? So a lot of middle-class women, including some Jewish women, went to Paris and enrolled in art academies there in the late 19th century. Julie Wolftorn, for example, was one of those Jewish women artists who took advantage of Paris academies. Some were able to enroll in art academies in Germany in the early 20th century, like the Munich Damen Academy. Käthe Kollwitz, for example, a non-Jewish artist who's very well known, studied there. Gabriele Munter also studied there shortly after 1900. But other Jewish women artists, and probably non-Jewish women artists as well, who didn't have the resources to study at art academies because sometimes the tuition was quite high, would have pursued other options like art art historian Shulamit Ber has researched artists like Olga Oppenheimer, who was from Cologne, who trained in private studios in Munich and Paris and gave lessons in painting and drawing in order to support herself, right? But that sort of like behind the scenes training with colleagues and fellow artists in studios is something that we can't discount. And that's where I think also a lot of the training of an artist like Rachel Schally took place. She claimed to have studied at the German Academy in Munich, but she's not listed among their matriculation records. So perhaps it was sort of a claim to sort of solidify her place in the art world, sort of make a name for herself and show that she had training, but perhaps she studied more informally with friends and with colleagues, or unofficially audited classes, maybe was never officially enrolled in some of those places. So we have to sort of use our imaginations to think about how people had access to training, how women had access to training. But I would say Jewish women in general had similar access to their non-Jewish counterparts. The Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen offered women artists who were based in Berlin access to a variety of classes under its own auspices. It sort of had members teaching classes at different times. So women artists who were members of this organization or even just affiliated with this organization could learn from other artists who were part of the organization. And it also organized regular exhibitions and events that helped its members participate in larger Berlin exhibitions. So that was one way that it provided access for women artists to get into the mainstream, into the bigger scene. And I think it also provided, we shouldn't discount that it provided a sense of community, kind of gave those women artists other women with whom to dialogue and collaborate and build off of and actually do projects together on some levels. With Rachel Schally, there's no dispute or there's no discussion about whether she was a Jewish artist because so much of her work has these very explicitly Jewish subjects, very interesting for those who are studying Jewish art or who are interested in Jewish art. Some other artists from this period who didn't necessarily depict many overtly Jewish subjects, but who had these kind of connections to the Jewish community. And this is where I would put Julie Wolfthorn and Käthe Munzer-Neumann into this category. What's interesting is that Wolfthorn in particular has received some well-deserved new attention recently, and there was just an exhibition of her work in Berlin. But most of the scholars working on her don't seem to acknowledge or don't seem to have awareness of the fact that Jewishness did play a role in her career before 1933. And that's a point that I'd like to emphasize and one that I'd like to make. I think that that's been overlooked in telling her story. And Käthe Munzer-Neumann, I don't really think that there has been much research about her in English. She did survive the war and spent the rest of her life in France, and I think she was fairly successful there. But I haven't found too much about her at all. But she, before the war, also had strong connections to the Jewish community and to the Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen, right? So she was, as did Wolfthorn, right? Everyone was sort of in all of these different circles. The Jewish women artists knew each other from different aspects of their life, right? They would have overlapped here and overlapped there, both in the women's circles and also maybe the Jewish ones. So it's kind of interesting to think about how they must have continued to bump into each other. And again, we return to that idea of community, right? The community would have been created for them, even if it wasn't something that they prized in their personal lives or something that they built upon. It was still there. It was still structures in place that were supporting them in different ways.
Gertrude Sandmann received her education at various private studios like many other women receiving arts training at the time. Getting tutored at arts academies specifically for women and in private studios was much more expensive than getting trained at the state academies. Male teachers who did not want women to be able to go to the official arts academies were totally fine taking their money and teaching classes in private studios, themselves benefiting financially from the surcharge and gender segregation. In 1915, Sandmann entered a pro forma marriage with Dr. Hans Rosenberg, but soon divorced him. Her father died in 1917, and the same year, until 1921, she continued her studies with Otto Kopp in Munich. She also later studied in Paris and Florence. The first of her works available in the digitized Berlinische Gallery collection are from 1917 and 1918, and are several nudes and sketches in the same confident, intimate, and direct style that she carries throughout her life. Sandmann also did fashion magazine illustrations for a period of time. From 1921 to 1922, she studied with Kata Kolowitz. In 1923, Gertrude Sandmann had her first solo exhibition at Meineckestrasse 1 in Charlottenburg. Around the corner is the Jewish Adult Education Center and Library on Fasanenstrasse, where I picked up a copy of Dr. Anna Havemann's biography of Sandmann. Thanks to her work, I am able to read aloud many incredible quotes from Sandmann's diaries that are published in the biography.
My name is Anna Havemann. I'm an art historian and I currently run the Hauskunstmitte, or I am the curator of Hauskunstmitte, the House for Contemporary Art right in the center of Berlin. Yeah, thanks to my student days at New York University Institute of Fine Art and also to my days at Hunter College, I was introduced to queer studies and gender studies and feminist art history early on, and I must say I was really happy that my professors, whom quite a few of them were female professors, introduced women artists quite naturally in their lectures. So it was never a question of why are you discussing women artists? Were there women artists? Are they of any importance? These questions weren't raised. The question was, no, it was always, they were included in the lectures quite naturally, and I was invited to study women artists' works from the beginning, and I wrote all my papers about women artists. So it's been part of my upbringing as an art historian to question the art historical canon and to question the male-dominated canon and to question the patriarchal system of the art market. And that's why I think it's important to give marginalized artists visibility. And for me, it's about equality in the society as well as in the art world. So whoever creates wonderful works of art, interesting works of art, important, touching, special works of art, needs, from my point of view, needs to be supported. I think in Germany there's still, these feminist art history courses, but they're like separate courses, and I think that's ridiculous. I think we should talk about artists in all of them in the same lecture and not in separate courses. Also not in queer study courses, but in art history courses. Yeah,
because it's all art history. Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Yeah, I used to be the curator of Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen for quite a few years. I supported them by publishing a big catalog for them, by organizing exhibitions for them. But I got interested in Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen back in 20 years ago already, when I did research for my thesis. Yeah, because the Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen is an old institution. It was founded in 1867, and it did a lot for the professionalization of women artists. So it was really important because Verein der Berliner Künstlerinnen organized an art school for women artists, organized annual exhibitions, gave out grants, supported older women artists by paying pensions. So it was unbelievable what they accomplished back in the late 19th century, when women artists had no rights and could not participate in the political life or even organize like an art school or a Verein. That was absolutely impossible, and they still managed to do that even though they were restricted by law. And so I was very inspired by what the ladies did back in the late 19th century, and I always thought we can learn from them how courageous, how adventurous, and how smart they were. And a lot of female artists who became known, studied at the school, the art school of der Berliner Künstlerin, because the public schools, the art academies were closed to women artists up to 1919. So where did women artists get education? At the Verein der Berliner Künstlerin. That's where Paula Moder-Sambecker studied. That's where Käthe Kollwitz studied or taught as a professor. So I was very inspired by the history of the association, and later on worked for the association and supported the contemporary women artists. Also, that's what I try to do here at Haus Kunstmitte, support women artists. We function like a regular museum, except for we don't have a permanent collection on view. We work more like an exhibition center. So every 3 months we have new exhibitions, and usually either one on 2 floors or 2 on each floor. So right now we have 2 exhibitions. So we have quite a lot of exhibition space. The first exhibition we showed here in Haus Kunstmitte was on women professors and their female students. So it was like a big statement on my part to show that there's been already a history of female professors, and there have been quite a few generations of younger students, female students.
Alongside her artistic studies, Gertrude Sandmann was learning about her love for women and the queer scene, and joined the USPD, or the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. Lily Zucklampen, who was painted by Martel Schwichtenberg, was in a relationship with Sandmann during the early years of World War I. In the 1920s, Sandmann joined the GEDOK, or the German-Austrian Community of Artists and Art Lovers, and lesbian publications were starting to become a very important way that community was formed. I spoke with Hani Steinkopf-Frank about these publications and her article from 2023, Publishing Queer Berlin.
My name is Hannah Steinkopf-Frank. I use she, her pronouns. And I work as a journalist at Le Monde, the French newspaper, but I also do freelance work, reporting largely on issues around culture, history, a bit into politics, a lot of focus around identity, whether that's around sexuality, a lot around Jewish identity. I've been living in France. I'm working as a journalist here for almost 5 years now. And I'm always drawn to stories about underrepresented histories, narratives that challenge how we view history, and particularly who we place in those narratives and who's are given a voice, because there's always been minorities across the definition of that in history doing amazing work, playing very important roles, but sadly so often those histories are forgotten or underreported. And they're fascinating, and so that's always been a really large part of my journalistic practice is finding those sorts of narratives and reporting on them. And I've written quite a bit for JSTOR Daily, which is where this piece came out in, and they love sort of unexpected narratives that really challenge our perceptions of history. The first story I did for them was about a medieval Italian nun who might have been a lesbian, and that is exactly the sort of story that I love, and I'm always so searching to find and report on more and bring those also to a popular audience, because I feel often those narratives can sort of stay in academic spaces, which are great as well, and that research is super important. But I think it's also really important that those stories are brought to a broader audience as well. And, you know, you asked me how I learned about these queer publications in Berlin, and it took me a second to remember, because I hear about stories in so many different ways, whether that's from friends. While doing research for another topic, I might stumble on something, a museum expo, a book, or an article I'm reading that sparks an interest. So it's often hard to remember, but I'm pretty sure that this came from a TikTok of some historian, and I think they were mostly talking about the gay male queer publications in Berlin. And I think they just briefly mentioned the fact that there were around 6 lesbian publications in Berlin in the interwar years, and that truly stopped me in my tracks. I knew that there had been a lot of research and interest in the queer scene and culture in Berlin, largely around Magnus Hirschfeld and his institute, but the fact that there was also such a flourishing publishing industry just really immediately grasped my attention as a journalist to care so much about these issues. And the amazing thing when you're writing and researching history about that is so much is often anecdotal, or we have lost these archives, we've lost this evidence. And here was like, no, we have most of these copies of these publications. They're easily accessible. A lot of them have been digitized. And I mean, as a journalist, as someone interested, that's just like a gold mine. You're like, okay, I need to look at these. I need to research these. And there's no refuting that these existed and they were important because we still have them to this day. It's a very difficult media environment currently. And sadly, a lot of places that close first are geared at, audiences and contributors who didn't necessarily have a voice in mainstream media. And I was just thinking wow, this one city had 6 lesbian publications, today, if there are 6, queer focused publications that get as much attention, that's, pretty amazing to me. So just the flourishingness of that industry was really compelling to me. I mean, there was no social media. This was the communications medium. The time, print media had an incredible importance before the emergence of other forms of communication, whether that be television or, like I said, more modern online communication. So this was how people would learn about events. It's how they would connect and build community, and on so many levels as well, not only on the personal individual, but also, like you mentioned, whether that also be professional or have a political activist angle as well. These publications could really serve as a vehicle for community building. And you'd hear about events, you'd hear about new bars opening up, and also a sense of safety, the places where you would be accepted. And, like I mentioned in my article, it was both a pretty radical time in Berlin and Germany and many other countries more broadly to be a woman, where post First World War you had access to the public sphere relatively more. And even, as a cis straight woman, that's pretty radical, but adding in a queer identity as well, having more opportunities is a pretty destabilizing and big change. And having publications that could serve as sort of guides, and there were also some of the writers who wrote for them put together literal guides to queer Berlin.
In 1922, Sandmann created a charcoal drawing of 2 nude figures with low buns and titles it Group IX, Group 9. I asked Hannah Steinkopf-Frank what she thought of this piece.
Yeah, well, the Sandmann, I love sketches. I love things that feel like they came from an impulse. Obviously there was thought behind it, but it's not like a very formal painting that took sketches, that took a lot of pre-thinking before the art was created. I love that just feels like something that was done in the moment. And what's interesting with that one as well is the broad strokes of it, the fact that they aren't looking. I was talking about that idea of identification with art, and that just, for me, felt like a piece that so many people could see themselves in, or just see emotion in the connection, both, physical and intimate, between the two figures. So I thought that was very lovely.
I also asked Hannah Michelle Provisor what they thought.
My name is Hannah Michelle Provisor. I use she, they pronouns. I am an artist and queer person, and I do a lot of different types of art. Currently, I'm working on a 18th century short film that is about lesbian erasure in the 18th century. In a certain way, this short film also has to do with my anger at lesbians being erased from history. It's also funny. I find it very funny the ways that we have specifically taken lesbians out of history, but it's also very sad. And if I think about it too hard, it does make me angry. So yeah, a lot of my art making comes from that feeling. There's so many best friends and roommates in history that we can look back at in 2024 and say, oh my gosh, they were doing it. It's obviously to me it does look queer, but when you look closer at it, you see that it is not as overt as some of these paintings I'm talking about that have been labeled as straight. It is not as overt. And I think that's on purpose because of the time. It would have been scary to be as overt. And also she could kind of hide because obviously female nudes were something we saw all the time. So like if she had to, she could say, this has nothing to do with queer people at all. So it just has it has more of a rich undertone to it than, some of these paintings that I'm just like, well, that looks so gay, But yeah, it's just beautiful. I love that drawing of hers.
In the interwar years, Sandmann's artistic career continued to blossom, participating in collective exhibits of the Neue Sensation movement, 1925 Akademie der Kunst Fall exhibition, the black and white exhibition of the Akademie der Kunst, and being exhibited at the Royce and Pollock Graphic Cabinet and Antique Bookshop on Potsdamer Straße. She stayed friends with Käthe Kollwitz and was forging other important connections and memories during this time.
I don't go to church, I go to the forest. And then I think of the dear one, God, or by the sea, or when it's completely quiet in the room. Then I make up my mind that I will always make an effort to be good and ask the good Lord to help me. Or under the stars, I feel how great God is and how he doesn't let anything get lost, not even me. How beautiful what has been created is, and I'm grateful that I can see and feel. Nazi, anti-cultural, anti-liberal, anti-spirit, step backwards. They create contrast between people instead of humanity, borders between countries instead of an earth community. Against the women, muscle instead of head, fist instead of spirit. Against the Jews. Unfortunately, I'm ashamed, I was never friendly to Jews. Defensive. Doesn't want to be like that, the similar thing is the most hated. But now it would be cowardly not to profess to be a Jew now. The Jews must now emphatically be Jews. Today in the Basel National newspaper, there was news that from now on, Jews are forbidden from entering the Wannsee beach. Certainly not important compared to the destruction of livelihoods, but a mark. This is no longer about competitiveness, about egoistic appropriation of power, work, and earnings. Here, it should only be insult. The dirty Jew in contrast to the pure German girl, the pure Aryan insult. It fills me with poison and bile, nausea. If only you could at least defend yourself. But having to accept something like that in silence is something that needs to be learned first.
On the 8th of March, she writes,
I'm afraid of waking up in the morning, of what the mail will bring, of every ring of the bell. But I can't do that. I can't think about what the future might bring. I can't allow myself to do that. I can't afford it. Otherwise, I'll have to give up trying to get through it and endure it. If I want this, I can't do the other. Otherwise, I can't keep my strength. I have to trust, hope, pray, and want it.
By October of 1941, escape became almost impossible, and deportations to ghettos and concentration camps started occurring. Conditions quickly got worse, and she had her valuables stolen by Nazis and was forced to pay fines, and many lesbians and gender nonconforming people were deported to concentration camps and labeled as antisocial. Sandmann was exempt from forced labor because of her health conditions. In February 1942, she writes, Uncle Arthur comes to me every Friday morning. We always look forward to it. We play the harmonica together. He, very well, I, moderately, but really enjoy it. Every time he plays me the wonderfully comforting song, An die Musik by Schubert, Victory of the Spirit over the Earthly. This is how you have little joys when you make them for yourself. In the summer of 1942, her uncle and aunt were deported to Theresienstadt and murdered. Gertrude Sandmann decided to go underground. In November, with the knowledge that her friends, the Grossmans in Treptow, could hide her, she left a fake suicide note in her apartment and hid at Onkenstrasse 11 in East Berlin. Her family home was ransacked and pillaged. While she was in hiding, the situation regarding her basic nutrition and safety was dire. The Grossmans shared their rations with her, and her friend Kitty Kuza, who was delivering food to many in Berlin, also stopped by and gave groceries to Sandmann. She was only allowed to go out at night and in disguise, and when there were air raids, she could not go into the shelter due to the risk of being discovered. In 1943, the Hirschfeld Institute was bombed, and Sandmann was still in hiding with the Grossmans. In the final years of the Shoah, millions of Jewish, Roma, Sinti, queer, and disabled people were systematically murdered. Dr. Hilla Levy wrote in her essay, Being a Jewish Lesbian in Berlin, Belonging in Solidarity During the Weimar Era and the Third Reich, quote, However, a number of stories of Jewish lesbians rescued by non-Jewish partners and friends attest to the strength of lesbian circles, solidarity that began in many cases within the framework of Berlin's nightlife. In the case for Sandmann, her community, lesbian and otherwise, helped save her life. In 1944, Sandmann found a new hiding spot with the help of her friend Susie Herman and her partner Hedwig, otherwise known as Johnny Kozlowski, whom she had been dating since 1927. Sandmann lived in an abandoned pergola in Biesdorf, and when it got too cold, she lived in Johnny's apartment on Eisenacher Strasse 103 in Schöneberg. After the war ended, Sandmann was allocated a pension and an apartment in Schöneberg at Eisenacher Strasse 89 that had 3 rooms and furniture, her final residency. She had a balcony there and a small garden. Due to the suffering she endured living in hiding, she lost so much weight from malnutrition and was diagnosed with a thyroid disorder, gallbladder disease, and a heart and circulatory disorder. In 1948, she was treated for 3 months at Klinik am Waldhaus after a fall. In 1949, Sandmann's works were shown at a graphic exhibition in the Charlottenburg Palace and Rathaus Schöneberg, and she journeyed to Italy to see her sister after being forced to spend 10 years apart. In my observations of the Berlinische Gallery's online collection of Sandmann's work that are digitized, I found the abundance of paintings and new drawings in Italy very beautiful. It seemed like after so much time not having access to the artistic scene, she could finally again do what she loved and draw people and strangers that interested her. She wrote in her diary from Rome in December of 1949, The desire to eat and the craving for food is almost uncontrollable at first. like a fear that if you don't eat what comes your way, you'll miss out on something forever. There are so many desires to eat that have been repressed for years, and the equally imperious demands of the incorrectly nourished body. For me, the new food is just as sensational as experiencing everything unknown here. I've never been so lazy, not just idle, but also mentally lazy. I let myself drift along, smiling stupidly. That's how I appear to myself. That's exactly what's relaxing. Everything, Berlin, worries for terrible years, is so far gone, washed away, further away than the circumference of the earth. Sandmann kept in touch with Charlotte Grossman from Treptow and would send packages to East Berlin with tea, coffee, chocolate, money, or clothing every 2 to 3 months. In 1951, 3 of her works were purchased by the Berlin magistrate, and in 1952, in the Schöneberg City Library, she had a solo exhibition of black and white drawings. 2 of her drawings were in the Great Berlin Art Exhibition of 1958. In 1968, Sandmann had a show at Haus am Kleispark with over 70 works. In the midst of reconstruction after the Shoah, West Berlin's government decided to keep many of the fascist laws and standards from the time of the Third Reich. This included oppressive laws criminalizing queerness and non-cisgender heterosexual families and dynamics. Christianity's influence on the political sphere, and along with it, anti-Semitism and homophobia and transphobia, were reflected into the attitudes of the times. As we can feel almost 80 years since May 8, 1945, denazification in the East or West was never really fully successful. The 1970s is a critical decade in queer West Berlin history. In 1969 and 1973, the West German government changed the law so that consensual sex between men 21 years or older was no longer criminalized. After the Stonewall riot in 1969, conversations about coming out and visibility were first bubbling up in the community, and this is seen in queer publications. In 1979, the first Pride March was held in Berlin and called Christopher Street Day, or CSD, in honor of the New York City street where Stonewall Inn is located. In 1972, Sandmann started to write a series of letters to Dr. Walter Huder, the director of the Akademie der Kunst at the time, who is considered to be the founder of German exile research. I visited these letters at the reading room at Robert Koch-Platz. Her letters are in swooping blue cursive, and then towards the end of the exchange, she sends letters from a typewriter, which I am able to read. They exchange pleasantries, and she continues to write to him, asking for an exhibition to be set up of her work, and wants for him to use his contacts to do so. She explains that before her house was bombed in 1944, she was a citizen of Tiergarten and desires an exhibition in her previous district where she grew up. In 1974, Sandmann has a solo exhibition at the Galerie Wohlmel in Dusseldorf, and Eva Kolowitz, the granddaughter of Kata Kolowitz, wrote the foreword in the catalog. The catalog has paintings with cracked eggs, a woman holding a bowl, a horse chestnut bursting open, and it features the photo of Sandmann painting in her artist smock, taken by Eva Kolowitz. She mailed this catalog to Dr. Huder. In 1971, Homosexual Action West Berlin, or HAW, was founded, and soon after, some women split and founded the Lesbian Action Center, or LAZ. In a conversation with a Spinnboden employee, I learned the founding year of Spinnboden was 51 years ago, in 1973, because that was the year that Homosexual Action West Berlin had a note in their minutes that they wanted to start an archive of meeting materials. In the 1980s, Gudrun Schwarz, with other lesbians, officially opened the Spinnboden archive in her home. And in 1983, they moved into a space in Wedding. Since 1995, they have been located at Weiberwirtschaft in Mitte. Spinnboden now has over 50,000 objects in its collections, and it's growing all the time. Queer archives and the preservation and exploration of history is vital to our present and future. Spinnboden Archive, the Magnus Hirschfeld Society, and FFBIZ, the Feminist Archive, are currently fundraising to secure an updated, integrated, accessible, and permanent place for a collective archive center in Neukölln. The link to donate is on all their social medias and in the show notes. In 1974, L74, L for Lesbos, and 74 for the year of founding, split from the Lesbian Action Center group and the homosexual West Berlin group because they wanted to form affinity community with other like-minded and mostly older lesbians. The group was founded by Gertrude Sandmann and Kitty Köse and other friends. Sandmann called herself a lesbian, which was maybe a more archaic, formal, or less politically charged way of saying lesbo or lesbian. As a member of L74, Gertrude Sandmann wrote and made art for their magazine called Unsere kleinen Zeitung, or Our Little Newspaper. UKZ, or UKZ, was reminiscent of lesbian magazines from the Weimar period when most of these women had spent their young adulthoods. They were named as such because a way to purchase lesbian magazines in the 1920s at kiosks was to ask for Our Little Newspaper as a code phrase. At Schwinboden, they have the UKZ collection as bound volumes, or the loose original ones. I chose the originals to flip through. I did not know they would be so colorful and fun, like the colors of saltwater taffy. Light mint green, bright orange, yellow-orange, pink, blue, red. Unsere kleine in small text and Zeitung a little bigger. At the bottom it says Zeitung der Gruppe L74 DM 2.00. The drawings and articles inside these pages are interesting, relevant, and fun to me, a queer person 50 years later. The text is usually large and easy to read, and there's a theme each month. Some articles I noticed were titled Lesbians in Politics, Dreams, Poetry, Lesbians in the Nazi Time, Cultural History, Sie sind lesbisch, Alt und Schön, Lesbians on Vacation, Lesbians in Motherhood, and the list goes on. The drawings and photos inside the pages are very delightful. They are of butterflies, lino cuts, nude sculptures, dragons, stained glass windows, women about to kiss, cats with fangs, witches on broomsticks, naked women from behind. Sandmann, of course, has her art included in these pages, her Frauenact and her drawing of the lovers. In the UKZ issue from March of 1977, Gertrude Sandmann writes, "The artist colleagues usually show more tolerance for their fellow human beings than is usual, and with the others, the cheerful artistic crowd has a bit of freedom from fools. My independence gives me the opportunity and the obligation not to deny my lesbianism and to stand up for those of the same disposition at every opportunity. I do." The magazine UKZ was in circulation for over 25 years, from 1975 to 2001. Sandmann had her art featured on the cover of many of the early years of publication. Hannah Michelle Provisor gives us some insight into what they think of this drawing.
A lot of historians, or whoever is titling these paintings, will title them things like women gossiping or women sitting, like things like this. They'll bring it down to like the most basic thing of what the painting is about, in order to kind of throw off any scent of queerness. Whereas then you'll find with like artists who are openly lesbian, like Gertrude Sandmann has a painting that was on the cover of that magazine that's called Lovers. So it's very obvious.
This motif is also on her grave memorial stone. On January 6, 1981, Gertrude Sandmann died. I placed a stone in her honor. Together with her partner, the acrobat Tamara Streck, they share a memorial stone at the old St. Matthias Cemetery at the top of the Rote Insel in Schöneberg. This was a community project initiated by Traute Böhmann and placed on Sandmann's 120th birthday. Sandmann is still remembered to this day, and her work and legacy have been featured in exhibits at the Potsdam Museum, Berlinische Galerie, Haus am Kreispark, and recently at the Schwules Museum for their exhibits Lesbian Visions in 2018 and Love at First Fight in 2024. Sandmann's biographer, Dr. Anna Havemann, was introduced to her work about 15 years ago.
I was introduced to the work of Gertrude Sandmann, I believe in 2007, by the former owner of her drawings and diaries. And he collected her drawings in his attic, and he took me up to his attic and opened his, what do you call them, these things that are maps? Yeah, they were like in big, because they're only drawings, right? She didn't do any paintings, so they were in just these big folders, yeah? He introduced me to her work by opening up his folders, and there weren't that many. But eventually, when we started working on her estate, we realized that he owned 3,000 works. And he asked me if I thought it was of any interest, and then he showed me her diaries, and I couldn't believe my luck, because I thought it's amazing to have a complete oeuvre in front of you, and also the written statements. Yeah, I had organized another exhibition for an unknown woman artist at the Potsdam Museum, and this person approached me, and maybe I had made a name as somebody who's interested in giving visibility to unknown women artists, and that's why he approached me. Yeah, and he actually knew Gertrude Sandmann as a little boy. He used to visit her together with his mom, and his mom was the back then working in Berlin in the mayor's office of the Berlin mayor in Rathaus Schöneberg, and she was the first to try to write her catalog resume. So she actually visited Gertrude Sandmann almost every week, and Peter Howard Mohaci, her son, accompanied her. And when Gertrude Sandmann died, she gave 1/3 of her works to Peter Howard Mohaci's mother. That's why he had so many. And he always knew that there were 2/3 more. Like, there was no 2/3 is the wrong word, how do you say it? There was at least 3 times more works, but he didn't know where the people were who owned the works. And through the little biography, they actually found out about me and approached me and talked to me, and then also gave the works that they owned, which were at least 6,000 works, to the Berlinische Galerie. So the Berlinische Galerie now owns at least 6,000 works, and Potsdam Museum owns 3,000 works. And to my great pleasure, Berlinische Galerie often exhibits works of hers, so that's really nice. And they, I think, also recorded all the works, digitalized all of the works, so you can actually go online catalog at Berlinische Galerie and go through her entire oeuvre of what they own. I started doing research, and I started exhibiting her work, and the little biography actually came out of a later project, because I first exhibited her work at the Potsdam Museum and later on in Haus am Gleispark, and I think in correlation of the exhibition Haus am Gleispark we published a little miniature.
I see, because it says also, I think, here in Zusammenarbeit mit Haus der Presse.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was.
Yeah, and that was in 2011. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the first exhibition we did in Potsdam was in 2009. Mm-hmm. Nothing has been written about her. She's been included in a few exhibitions on lesbian artists, but there hadn't been a biography on her, and so they asked me to write a little biography, and actually transcribing the diaries was the biggest job.
That's her handwriting.
Yeah, there's also the old handwriting, Zitterlin, which I don't read, so I needed help with that. And Haus am Gleispark, they also helped me with transcribing the diaries, so I have quite a few big, thick folders with the transcription, and from that I try to include the information I've taken from the diaries with the information I could gather about the time. I actually got a grant to document her oeuvre, which was amazing, because then we could actually digitalize it completely, and I got some money to transcribe the diaries. And because I think we have at least 20 of her diaries. 20? Yeah.
We talked about how she was able to encourage the purchase of thousands of pieces of her work by the Potsdam Museum.
It all happened because I was working at the Potsdam Museum and we raised the money to buy her works, and then so that's why they're there. Because you wonder, as a person nowadays, how they actually survive, because we have works from the late 1930s, so how did she go about creating works when she couldn't leave the house or buy paintbrushes? So I don't really know. Also, I don't know how she managed to save her works. If we're talking about 9,000 works of art, it means quite a few suitcases. How did she get the suitcases out of the house? Who hid them? Especially because she was from a well-to-do background and she lost all her family belongings except for the artworks. So how did she do that? Diaries, yeah. So I'm not sure how she managed to do that, but that was also something that impressed me.
I also asked about the House am Gleispark exhibit that was organized in 2010, 2011, and how that came about.
What we did for House am Gleispark was to show or give an introduction to her artworks in a general sense. So we showed early and later works, and because they have smaller cabinets or smaller rooms, we created one. We showed only her dark paintings, and the dark paintings we related back to her experience of living in hiding for such a long time, and so that was a very intense way of in terms of curatorial approach, to put these in one room with and darkened walls, so that a sense of claustrophobia would maybe transport it. Yeah, did focus on the early works up to the mid-1930s, I believe, to show also how she developed artistically and where she got her ideas from as an artist. So to give a good overview of her art and her development as an artist. So it was nice for the works to return home. And I got really nice responses from people. People were very touched by the artworks. And I did talk to quite a few ladies who knew Gertrude Sandmann when they were young.
Really?
Yeah, so they also owned works, and so it was nice to talk to some, not witnesses, but
acquaintances.
Because through the lesbian community. Mm-hmm. But I think she was a great source of inspiration for them, because she openly lived her lesbian life in West Berlin when she was in her late 60s and 70s, and I think that was something important for the younger women to see her as a role model. They asked for her opinion. I think they asked for her judgment. So I think the ladies I talked to, they were really seeing her as a very important motherly figure, and strong person to look up to.
She's like the grandma.
Grandma.
To all these people.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about Sandmann and look at some paintings I mentioned in this piece, you can pick up Dr. Havemann's book or go to the Wir waren Nachbarn exhibit to view her biography book at the Schöneberg Rathaus. On Sunday, September 22nd, there will be a free community event at Schminboden where we will create our own Sandmann-inspired charcoal and chalk drawings and enjoy a photo presentation of her life. All experiences and abilities are welcome. Link to sign up is in the show notes. Sandmann, unlike many, has a very unique and colorful memorial plaque on her former house, which you can also visit to learn more and see photographs. The creation of this memorial was initiated by the owner of the apartment, who, in close connection with the LGBT community, was very supportive of the memorial action and celebrating Sandmann's life and work. Professor Carrie Wallach described how she learned about Gertrude Sandmann and her encounter with this memorial.
I came across her because I know she was a student of Käthe Kollwitz, and that Kollwitz was a strong supporter of Sandmann and other lesbian artists, including Gerda Rotermund. But I'm most familiar with Sandmann because I've spent a lot of time in Berlin-Schöneberg, and I love the area around Eisenacher Straße, and I really became familiar with her. She came to my attention because of the informational plaque dedicated to her that's in the Eisenacher Straße in Schöneberg. And so to me, that's a very striking plaque. It's very, it's in color. It's really large and vibrant. It's really nice to see if you're just a passerby. But for me, Sandmann is interesting. I think one of the reasons why her memory is so well documented is because she survived. And so for me, it's sort of on my mind that we also need to remember the artists who did not survive and for whom there were fewer people to sort of put up a plaque and help those in the neighborhood remember them. Yeah.
On a very hot day in August, I decided to come to the Berlinische Gallery on Museum Sunday when the entrance is free and the energy is light. The accessibility of a free museum on the first Sunday of the month draws an interesting mix of people, with many solo wanderers, families with children, tourists, and locals. It breaks down barriers to viewing and interacting with incredible art. I'm really glad Berlin started this program in 2021. I decided to spend some time riding in front of their Sandmanns currently on display, and I recalled what Professor Wallach said about what it means to be a Jewish artist and to make Jewish art.
When we think about Jewish artists, we can ask the question of were they Jewish by background or were they Jewish artists because they depicted Jewish subjects in their art? And then we get into this other question of what is a Jewish subject in art? Does it have to be something related to a holiday or a ritual or some kind of Jewish practice, tradition? Could it also be simply a Jewish person who is a Jewish subject in its own way? What about subjects and those who are working in the field of Jewish art? People like Samantha Baskin and Larry Silver tend to take a kind of broad definition when they think about what is Jewish art, where they also think about the Jewish experience and what that means and entails in all of its different facets. So when we think about things like exile and diaspora and wandering and being on the move and emigration.
I'm sitting now across from one of my favorite series of Sandmanns, The Emigrants 1, 2, and 3. 3 portraits of chalk and charcoal on paper of women wearing hats and scarves with their eyes downcast. I am spending time with the black-white Emigrant 3 from 1935. She is someone who I recognize. She's seated in an armchair with a cushion behind her back. She doesn't look comfortable at all. Her elbows rest on her thighs with her hands grasped tightly together. Sandmann doesn't take time to illustrate every finger and fingernail, but instead draws the energy of the hands coming together. The 2 thumbs on top of each other, the fingers of the left hand clasping the right hand. Her skirt is a dark gray or black and extends past her knees. She wears a long-sleeved dark shirt. Around her neck and on her head is a headscarf, drawn in the same dark charcoal as the skirt and arms of the chair. It is tied in a knot below her neck and extends down her back. The subject is centered in the middle of the paper. The most haunting and disturbing part of the painting is her eyes. Sandmann does not give us the satisfaction of a clear, forward-facing pose or position. Instead, the subject has her head lowered and her gaze distant. If you look long enough, it is almost as if she is staring at the floor slightly to the right of you. I kept glancing next to me to try and follow her gaze, and I only saw the gray, squeaky floors of the gallery. Her eyes are open wide, with dark circles underneath. Her eyebrows are thin, and her lips are pursed together. Erasure of gray smudges gives highlights above her eyebrows, on her cheeks, the bridge of her nose, and the sides of her face. Her hair is the same dark shade as her headscarf, creating confusion, where her hair gets covered up and the headscarf begins. To me, this look is very familiar. I feel this is the look of disassociation, of complete and utter exhaustion, of being so lost in one's own head, memories, and trauma that the eyes cannot focus on what is important in the current reality you see yourself in. The position of the body resting on itself, elbows digging into the flesh of the thighs, hands clasped tightly, is an attempt at creating the appearance of keeping oneself together, composed. The paper is a beige-ish light brown color. Sandmann creates place by coloring the background white. The white background is not flat, but instead full of movement and shadows. Above the subject's head, it looks as if Sandmann colored the white pastel over some of the hair or headscarf to reshape the head to her liking. Sandmann used the texture of the chalk to show us her freedom in her drawing. Her thick lines show she has a clear sketch she works from, and decides to include and not polish some of the marks. By leaving the outlines, we can understand more of her process and what she thought was sufficient in telling the story of this emigrant. We don't know if this emigrant has left, is leaving, or is going to leave, but all stages are embodied in the leaning and staring off to supposedly nowhere. The texture of the charcoal dragging across the paper is clear down the sides of the armchair, in her hair and in the headscarf. The figure emerges from the carefully but seemingly messily placed lines and smudges, showing Sandmann's understanding of portraiture, where less is more. She uses smudging and building up of white and black to make gray and provide rich pigmentation. I wonder if she used her fingers, an eraser, some cotton. Were her hands stained black when she was done creating? The chair itself is another interesting element in the painting. The armrests facing the viewer have the patterns of swirls and cross-hatching lines. Maybe the chair is woven or made out of wood. The pillow on the chair is the same light brown color as the original paper, but its indentations and shadows are gray and black, smudging with no regard for keeping the marks inside of a certain line or boundary. The edges of the cushion blend into the background, giving the look of soot, dirt, and general schmutz. The mood of the painting is dark, dismal, and frightening. The spirals in the armchair continue to draw us back into notice new elements of her hair, headscarf, shirt, and eyes. The painting is on a diagonal. The viewer sees the figure from the front, but notices that everything is tilted slightly to the left, with most of the darker colors in the lower left of the painting. The diagonal line formed by the skirt continues in the tie of the scarf and up again in the side of the cushion, drawing the eyes to start looking at the painting from the skirt and then to the hands, arms, scarf, and cushion. We lean in with the figure. Our hands become clasped. Our eyes become downcast, searching for what only she can perceive. There are holes in all four corners of the paper, maybe from pins or paper clips, 2 or 4 on each corner. The paper is also cut unevenly, as if from a larger piece. Sandmann signed the painting on the lower right with her initials, lowercase g and s, dating it 35. The size of the painting surprised me. I wrongfully thought her paintings would be smaller, but this painting is large, about A3 in size, and with a big black frame and a white mat board surrounding it. It is imposing in a way that contradicts the piece itself, but in a way that I like. Finally, these women are given their rightful place as cultural icons and protected with glass and framing. I wonder, what wisdom or knowledge did Sandmann wish to share by painting this series? Did she seek to understand and empathize? Did she want to make sure their stories were not forgotten? The namelessness does not escape me. Sandmann didn't name a lot of her paintings with the names of the subjects, but I still wish and long to know her name. Did she have a last name that was spelled in Yiddish like mine? Was her name Esther or Ruth like my great-grandmother's? We can't know, but we can say thank you for sharing your vulnerability, and thank you to Sandmann for capturing it. And we can continue to make the world a safer and better place so that those who are marginalized in our societies don't have to be constantly running to find safety and freedom. Thank you so much to everyone who helped with this project and to the guest experts who decided to take time out of their days to speak with me. You can find more information about everyone I spoke with and their work in the show notes. The full bibliography with sources and links can be found on the website www.passingthepaintbrush.wordpress.com. The current artists we are exploring this season are Gertrude Sandmann, Lotte Laserstein, and Tony Ebel, 3 incredible painters who survived the Shoah. This is a project hosted by the Spinnboot and Lesbian Archive and funded by Demokratie in der Mitte's Aktionsfond. Follow Friends of Dora on Instagram for further updates on upcoming episodes and workshops. I use the following music and sounds in this episode. Warmer by Andy G. Cohen, released under a Creative Commons BY 4.0 Attribution International License from the Free Music Archive. A Perceptible Shift by Andy G. Cohen, released under Creative Commons BY 4.0 Attribution International License from the Free Music Archive. Slow Moving Waves by Rest You Sleeping Giant, released under a Creative Commons BY 4.0 International Attribution License from the Free Music Archive. Ex Libris by Costa T, released under a Creative Commons BY 4.0 International Attribution License from the Free Music Archive. London Gallery Subdued Voices G by Martian on freesound.org number 49378, licensed under Creative Commons 0. Another Guitar Beat by Seth Makes Sounds on freesound.org number 724666, licensed under Creative Commons 0. Ocean Waves 06 by Lucas Schacht, freesound.org number 534915, licensed under Creative Commons 0. I have used the following songs that are over 100 years old, now in the public domain in the US and Europe, made available by the Mayrendt Institute for Yiddish Culture, held at the Mills Music Library at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Baruch Habo, composed by Louis Fritzell, recorded September 27, 1906 in Philadelphia, published by Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden, New Jersey. Haupt Machtonim, composed by Louis Fritzell, recorded September 1919, published by Emerson Phonograph Company in New York. I have also used the following public domain classical music records made available by the Open Educational Resources on Music, created by Ulrich Kaiser. Franz Schubert's Symphony No. 5 in B-flat major D485 First Allegro, played by the NBC Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Arturo Toscanini. Additional voiceovers by
Marielle Hansen-Folk.
Sandmann's quotes were translated by Deepl and Google Translate from the original German to English. If you want to tell your friends about this podcast or rate it on whatever platform you are listening from, that would be a free way to really help share this project with those who would be interested but do not know of it yet. This episode was written, produced, and mixed by me, Hani, with technical advising by Rocket Loam. Thanks for listening and stay creative.